Imagine you are a Norse traveler, a very long way from home, and the winter has caught you on an island where the trees have almost given up. The wind is off the sea, and there is nowhere to stand against it. And then, in the failing light, you see a low green hill rising out of the flat ground, and you understand, in the slow way that tired men understand things, that this hill is not a hill. Somebody made it. Somebody made it a very long time ago. And there is a small dark opening at its foot, half choked with turf, low enough that you would have to crawl. You crawl. The stone is cold against your shoulders. The passage smells of old damp and something older, and it keeps going, further than a shelter should. You come out at last into a chamber whose walls were laid before any song your grandfather ever sang, before any god your people ever named. The men with you have gone quiet. One of them, whose name is lost to us now, kneels against the wall, and with a blade he begins to scratch the sharp straight letters of his own alphabet into a stone that was already ancient when Rome was a village of huts. And that is the question we are going to sit with tonight. What did the Vikings feel when they broke into a tomb 3,000 years older than their gods? Tonight, we are going to spend a long, quiet evening with a single strange room on a small green island at the top of Britain. A room built roughly 5,000 years ago. A room that a group of Norsemen crawled into during a winter storm, some 900 years ago, and scratched their names upon, and left. We will walk very slowly through the whole of it. There is no rush at all. We have hours ahead of us, and the stones have been there for millennia, and neither of us is in any particular hurry. If these long, quiet nights are the kind of thing you like, if you have found your way to this voice in the small hours, or in the last hour of the evening, or at some strange time in between, then a subscribe would be very kind. And if you feel like leaving a comment, I would love to know where you are right now, and what time it is. There are people listening all over the world tonight, in different rooms and different weathers, and I always find that a lovely thing to picture. There is nothing you need to watch on the screen. You can close your eyes now if you like. You can let the lamp go off, and the room go soft around you, and my voice will keep going, gently, for a long time. If you fall asleep in the first chapter, or the middle, or at some point you can never quite remember later, that is entirely all right. Sleep is not something you are missing. Sleep is what we are here for. The place we are going to spend our evening in is called Maeshowe. Sometimes you will find it written as 2 words in older books, Maeshowe, but the sound of it is the same, a soft rolling word that seems to belong to the wind on those islands. It sits on the mainland of Orkney, in a parish called Stonehenge, in the north of Scotland, on a low wide plain of grass and stone, where the sea is never very far away. All around it stand its cousins. The standing stones of Stonehenge rise only a short walk in one direction, tall grey slabs already old when the first stones of the pyramids were quarried. The ring of Brodgar is a little further off, a great circle set on a narrow neck of land between 2 lochs, the water on either side catching whatever light the sky happens to be offering. And there was, long ago, a small village called Barnhouse, whose low foundations are still traceable in the turf. Maeshowe belongs to all of that. It is part of what is now called the heart of Neolithic Orkney, a scatter of monuments woven into one landscape, a landscape that was already ancient when the Romans first heard whispers of an island somewhere in the north. And tonight, we are going to walk in through its door. But before we go in, we should sit for a while with just how old this small green hill really is. There is a particular quiet trick that very old places play on us. You look at them, and they look like part of the landscape, and it takes a real act of the mind to remember that a person once thought about them, and planned them, and carried the stones, and set them down in a chosen order, and covered the whole of it with earth. The mound at Stonehenge looks, at first glance, like something the land simply did on its own, the way land sometimes gathers itself into a low hill for no reason at all. But it did not. Someone made it, and they made it a very long time ago. The best current dating that archaeologists have put to the building of Maeshowe places it's somewhere between about 2,800–2,700 years before the Common Era, in what we now call the late Neolithic. That is, in the reckoning of our own calendar, roughly 4,800 to 5,000 years ago. Say the number softly to yourself, and it does not feel like much. Say it slowly, and it begins to open. 5,000 winters. 5,000 springs. 5,000 slow turnings of the same sky over the same small hill. That is a very long time. To give the number a shape you can hold, it helps to set it beside other things. When the people of Orkney were finishing this mound, the Great Pyramid at Giza had not yet been built. Khufu's masons would not begin their work for another 200 years or more. The earliest writings so far found on the island of Britain lay many, many centuries in the future. The Bronze Age in these islands had not begun. Iron, as a worked metal, would not appear here for another 2,000 years after that. There were no cities anywhere in Britain. There were no wheeled carts in general use. Most of the land was still forest, dense oak and hazel and elm running down almost to the sea, and the human presence in it was small and scattered and quiet. Nobody was writing anything down. The word Britain had not yet been thought of. There was no such idea. The land had no name that has come down to us. The people who lived on it had names for themselves, of course, and names for their rivers and their headlands and their gods. But none of those names survived the crossing of so many centuries. What survived was stone. What survived was this mound, and Maeshowe was not built in isolation. It belonged to a wider moment, a whole burst of building on these islands, in the same handful of generations. Only a short walk away, the standing stones of Stennis were being raised. 4 tall grey slabs of the original ring still leaning against the wind today. A little further off, on the narrow strip of land between the 2 locks, the ring of Brodgar was taking shape. A great circle of stones set with a patience that is hard for us to imagine. Down by the water, the small village of Barnhouse was being lived in, its low walls and hearths busy with cooking smoke and voices. And on the western coast of the same Orkney mainland, the stone houses of Skara Brae were already old, sunk into their midden, their box beds and stone dressers, and hearths all set out with a domestic care that feels startlingly familiar when you stand among them now. All of this was one world. All of this was one people, or one closely woven set of peoples, working through the same generations, in the same weather, under the same stars. And they were building in this small archipelago at the extreme north of Britain, at a scale and a sophistication that seems, when you first hear of it, entirely out of proportion to the place. Orkney is not large. It is a scatter of low green islands off the top of Scotland, exposed to every wind the Atlantic can send. And yet, in the late Neolithic, its communities were raising monuments and villages that are by any measure among the finest of their kind anywhere in these islands. Some archaeologists have gone so far as to describe Orkney in that period as one of the cultural capitals of Neolithic Europe, though that phrase is a large one and worth holding gently. Indeed, some have suggested something even more striking. For a long time it was assumed that ideas travelled up to Orkney from the south, that these northern islands were a distant edge of a world whose centre lay elsewhere. But the evidence has been shifting. Some archaeologists have begun to argue that certain forms of building, certain kinds of pottery, certain ways of arranging stone and space, may have spread outward from Orkney rather than inward to it. That the small islands, in that one long season of their history, may have been sending ideas south to the rest of Britain rather than the other way round. This is contested. It is the sort of claim that shifts a little with each new excavation. But it is at least being seriously discussed. And that in itself is telling. Whatever the direction of influence, the fact of the moment is not in doubt. When Maeshowe was raised, the people who raised it were part of something confident, and skilled, and long practiced. They knew what they were doing. They had done it before, in other stones and other rings. And then, having built it, they let time have it. Try for a moment to picture 5,000 winters passing over this one small hill. The turf greens in spring, and browns in autumn and greens again. The grass grows, and dies back, and grows, and dies back, and grows. And no one counts the years because no one is there to count them, or because those who are there have other concerns entirely. Rain works on the turf. Wind works on the turf. Salt air, carried in off the sea, settles invisibly into everything. Sheep graze the slope. A single sheep, in some year around 1200 of the Common Era, stands on the crown of the mound, with its head down, entirely indifferent to the chamber sleeping beneath its feet, entirely uninterested in the fact that the stones under the grass are already 3,000 years older than anything the sheep's shepherd has ever imagined. That is the strange thing about a mound like this. From the outside, at almost any point in its long life, it has simply looked like a small green hill. Travelers passed it and did not know. Farmers ploughed nearby and did not know. Later, whole languages came and went across these islands. One people succeeded another. Gods were worshipped and forgotten. Kings rose and fell in the south. Rome came and left. And through all of it, the mound sat where it had been placed, keeping its own quiet counsel, holding its chamber in the dark. We tend, when we think of very ancient things, to think of them as ruined, as broken open, as visible in their oldness. Maeshowe was not for most of its life. It was closed. It was intact. It was, for something like 4,000 years, a sealed room under a hill, and the people who walked over it in those centuries knew almost nothing of what it was. They knew there was a mound. They gave it names in their own languages. They made up stories about it, some of which we will come to in time. But the inside of it, the reason for it, the careful geometry the builders had set down 5,000 years ago, all of that was simply held, in the dark, waiting. There is a kindness in thinking of it that way. Nothing was demanded of the mound. Nothing was demanded of the people who passed. The stones did not care whether they were understood. They only had to remain, and they did, patiently, through weather that would have worn softer things to nothing. But of course, a very old thing is only impressive from the outside if you know what shape it takes on the inside. And Maeshowe's inside is a room worth spending a while in. So let us leave the green slope for a moment, and the sheep, and the wind off the loch, and go quietly in through the low door in the side of the hill, and see what the builders actually made. I want to walk with you, slowly, through the actual physical body of Maeshowe. Not the meaning of it, not yet. Just the stones, just the shape. Because the shape, once you know it, stays with you, and everything that comes later, the runes, the earls, the winter storms, all of it happens inside this shape, or against it, or under its low ceiling. From the outside, as we have already seen, it looks like almost nothing. A grass-covered dome. Some sources give it as around 35 meters across at the base, and something like 11 or 12 meters high at the crown, though estimates vary a little depending on where you measure from. It is broad, it is low, it is softened by weather and turf, and it sits on the flat land as though it had grown there rather than been placed. That, I suspect, was the point. The people who raised it had the skill, quite clearly, to make something sharper, something more monumental. They chose instead to make something that could pass, at a glance, for a natural hill. The careful architecture is hidden inside a rounded, weather-softened shape. The mound is a kind of quiet disguise. The way in is easy to miss. It is a low, narrow opening at the base of the mound, facing roughly southwest. If you did not know it was there, you might walk past it in the long grass. There is no grand doorway, no lintel carved with anything showy, no threshold declaring what waits inside. Only a small, dark mouth in the side of the hill, framed in stone, opening onto the passage. And the passage is the first thing the builders make you feel in your body. It is a tunnel, stone-lined, approximately 10 meters long, though again the figure depends on exactly where one starts counting. It is low. It is low enough that a grown adult cannot walk down it upright. You must stoop, and if you are tall, you must nearly crawl. The stones of the passage are not small rubble but large flat slabs. And some of them are quite extraordinary. Single blocks of stone that run almost the whole length of one wall, laid in with a precision that seems almost impossible given the tools available 5,000 years ago. Whoever chose those stones chose them deliberately. Whoever set them with care. You have to crawl to enter it. That was a decision. Whoever built this room did not want you to walk in standing up. They wanted you low, they wanted you slow, they wanted your head bent. Whether that was because the space beyond was sacred, or because the descent was itself part of some rite, or simply because a low tunnel is easier to keep sealed and dry, we cannot really say. All three may be true at once. What we can say is that the geometry of the passage does something to the visitor, something it has been doing to every visitor for 5,000 years. It presses you down. It slows you. It makes the arrival at the other end feel like a small deliverance. Because at the other end, the space opens. The central chamber comes suddenly. One moment you are hunched in a stone tunnel. The next you are standing in a near square room whose walls step inward as they rise. This is the technique called corbelling. Each course of flat stones is laid so that it juts a little further inward than the course below it, and the next a little further still, and the next further, until the walls have leaned themselves gently in towards each other, and formed a self-supporting, tapering interior that closes toward a point somewhere above your head in shadow. There is no keystone, there is no arch. There is only the patient logic of stone laid upon stone. Gravity turned into architecture. The room holding itself up by the simple honesty of its own weight. And into the walls of this chamber, set at intervals at roughly chest height, are three small side cells. They are little openings, little dark alcoves cut into the thickness of the wall, small enough that a person would have to duck and reach to look inside. These are the cells where remains and offerings were once placed, though most of what they contained is long gone. From the middle of the room, they look like closed doors set at odd heights in the wall, three quiet punctuation marks in the great tapering silence of the chamber. I want to pause on the craft of it for a moment, because the craft is easy to overlook when one is thinking about meaning. The fitting of these stones is remarkable. They are dry-laid, without mortar of any kind. They are shaped and set so that they meet cleanly along their edges. The corners of the chamber are marked by tall, upright slabs, standing sentinel where the walls turn. And after nearly 5,000 years, after storm upon storm has washed over Orkney, after the temperature has risen and fallen countless thousands of times, after the mound has settled, and the turf has grown and been grazed and grown again, the chamber is still dry, still standing, still coherent. It has not collapsed. It has not filled with water. It has kept its shape. Some accounts describe a drainage system running beneath the floor, channels laid into the base of the mound to carry water away from the chamber, though the details of this are not entirely certain. And it is difficult to know how much of the tomb's remarkable dryness owes to deliberate engineering, and how much to the simple wisdom of where the builders chose to put it. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps they picked a well-drained ridge, and then, being who they were, added their own careful work beneath the floor for good measure. The end result, whatever the cause, is a room 5 millennia old that has never quite let the weather in. Let us stay inside for a little longer. Let us just be in the room. The first thing you notice, once your eyes adjust, is the air. It is cooler than the air outside. It is stiller. It smells faintly older, if that makes any sense. A scent that is really just earth, damp stone, and something almost mineral underneath. The small breath of a space that has been closed for a very long time. There is no wind in here. The wind that batters the outside of the mound, that comes in off the loch and hurries across the flat fields of Stennis, is reduced within the chamber to a faint, distant hush, muffled by the depth of stone and turf above. And the sound of your own body changes. A whisper carries. A footstep rings a little. The walls are close and hard, and they answer everything you do with a small, sharpened echo, so that you find yourself moving more quietly, speaking more softly, without ever quite deciding to. The room asks for a certain kind of behavior, and most people give it without protest. It is very difficult to be loud in Maeshowe. Something about the shape simply lowers the voice. Above you, the corbelled roof reaches upward and tapers into shadow. On a bright day, at the right angle, you can see the courses of stone leaning inward, one after another, until they close into darkness. On a dim day, you cannot see the top at all. There is only the sense of it going up and going in, into a stillness that has been there since long before anyone you have ever heard of was born. Around you, at chest height, the three small side cells wait in their walls, quiet and low. The floor beneath you is stone. The great slabs at the corners stand where they were placed. The whole geometry of the place holds, patient and self-sufficient, a small deliberate universe under a green hill. This is what the builders made. A hidden dome outside, a bent passage in, a tapering chamber where the air is older and the sound is closer, 3 little cells set into the walls, and a roof that leans quietly toward a point in the dark. That, in the simplest terms, is the shape of Maeshowe. But shape is not the whole of it. A room this carefully made was made for something. And there is one more thing about the shape of Maeshowe that we have not yet touched. It has to do, quietly, with the sun. Of all the details I know about Maeshowe, this is the one I find hardest to put down and walk away from. It is a small fact, easy to state in a single sentence, and yet the longer you sit with it, large it becomes. It has to do with the passage, that low bent tunnel through which you crawl to reach the chamber, and it has to do with a single day in the year, and it has to do with the sun. The passage of Maeshowe was not aimed at random. It was aligned. It faces roughly to the southwest, out toward the low ridge of hills across the loch, and it was oriented with quiet precision. At the point on the horizon where the sun sets around the winter solstice, in the days on either side of the 21st of December. On those shortest days of the year, in the last thin hour before the sun goes down, the light drops low enough to enter the mouth of the passage. It slides along its length, past the great slabs, under the weight of the mound, through 10 meters of narrow darkness, and it reaches the chamber at the other end. It touches the back wall, and for a few minutes, once a year, the tomb is not dark. That is worth saying again, gently, because it is the sort of thing that can slide past a tired ear without landing. A room deliberately built to be sealed inside a hill. A room with a passage so low you must stoop to enter. A room whose ordinary state is complete blackness, was engineered so that on the shortest afternoon of the year, the sun would come inside and lie against the far stone. That was designed. It is not a coincidence, and it is not a poetic reading of a chance angle. It is a piece of architecture worked out in stone 5,000 years ago, by people we cannot name. The alignment is precise enough to have survived a great deal. Horizons shift a little with the slow movement of the earth. Sea levels rise and fall. Peat grows over old sightlines. The exact geometry of sunset is not quite what it was in the Neolithic. And yet, each December when the weather in Orkney allows, the effect still occurs. Visitors gather in the dim chamber and wait, and if the clouds part at the right moment, a slow-moving stripe of golden light appears at the far end of the passage, travels along the stone floor, brightens against the back wall, and then fades. The whole event lasts only a matter of minutes. Then the sun drops below the ridge, and the passage goes dark again, and the room returns to its usual condition, which is stillness and shadow and the small close air of a place shut inside a hill. Maeshowe is not alone in doing this. The Neolithic peoples of the Atlantic edge seem to have been deeply interested in the sun, and in particular in the turning points of the year. In Ireland, at Newgrange in the Boyne Valley, an even older mound, built perhaps 2 or 3 centuries before Maeshowe, was aligned instead to midwinter sunrise. There, the first light of the shortest day enters through a small stone opening above the passage and reaches the chamber deep within. At Stonehenge, on Salisbury Plain, alignments to solstice, sunrise and sunset have been argued over for a very long time, and while the details remain debated, some form of solar intention seems very difficult to dismiss. Maeshowe belongs somewhere in that wider conversation, a conversation carried out across islands and coastlines in a language of stone and shadow, without a single written word to explain it. What that conversation actually meant to the people who built these places, we cannot say for certain. We can only sit with what the alignment might have expressed, and hedge every guess softly. Some archaeologists have suggested that Maeshowe was, among other things, a place where the dead were retouched, once each year, by the returning light of the sun. In this reading, the tomb held the bones or memory of ancestors, and the midwinter beam was a kind of gentle annual reunion, a promise that although the days had grown shortest, the light would come back, and that the dead within the mound were not entirely forgotten by the sky. Others have suggested a calendrical purpose, that the tomb served as a stone clock, telling the surrounding community with certainty that the year had turned, that the sun had reached its lowest point and would now begin, slowly, to climb again. Still others see the mound as one instrument in a wider ritual landscape, alongside the standing stones of Stennis and the great ring of Brodgar, in which the midwinter light was one carefully placed moment among many, a single note in a long ceremonial year. None of these readings excludes the others, and none of them can be proved. We may never know exactly what those people believed the light was doing when it slipped down the passage and touched the far wall. But we can say that they wanted it to happen, and that they built for it, and that it still happens. It helps to picture the Orkney midwinter itself, because the alignment lives inside that particular weather. On the shortest days of the year, this far north, the daylight lasts only about 6 hours. The sun rises late, well after 9 in the morning, and even at noon it does not climb very high. It hangs low across the sky, throwing long, soft shadows over the fields and the water, and by the middle of the afternoon, it is already sliding back toward the horizon. Twilight is enormously long here in winter, a slow grey dimming that seems to take hours, so that by the time the sun actually sets, the world has already been dusk for a great while. The wind off the loch is cold, the grass is bleached. The lochs of Stennis and Hooray, on either side of the isthmus, where Maeshowe sits, take on the colour of the sky, which is often the colour of pewter. Imagine standing outside on such an afternoon, on the flat ground near the mound, watching the low southwestern sun sink toward that far ridge. The light is thin and gold, the kind of light that makes even ordinary stone look precious. The mound is dark against the paler sky, and the mouth of the passage is a small black rectangle at its base, almost hidden in the grass. You wait, and then, at a certain moment, the sun drops to just the right height, and its last rays find the opening. From the outside, you would see very little. Perhaps only a change in the way the interior mouth of the passage gleams. From inside the chamber, though, it is a different matter altogether. If you're standing in that room in the dim, breathing the older air, watching the far end of the tunnel, you see the darkness in the passage begin, quietly, to catch fire. The light comes down the passage slowly. It is not a sudden flash. It arrives as a gathering, a brightening. Dust motes hang visibly in the air, where a moment before there was only shadow. A pale stripe appears along the stone floor, edging closer, and then reaches the chamber and touches the back wall, and the wall glows softly, warmed to a color that no lantern and no candle could quite copy, because it is the sun itself, 5,000 years old on this alignment, doing exactly what it was invited to do. And then, just as quietly, the beam thins. It shortens. It withdraws back along the passage the way it came. The stripe on the floor fades. The chamber returns to darkness. Outside, the sun has slipped below the ridge, and the long Orkney night begins. For a few minutes, once a year, the tomb is not dark. That was designed. That is the thing to hold on to, softly, before we move on. A room engineered so that the returning sun would visit it, in a specific week, in a specific way, for as long as the world lasted, or the alignment held. None of that architectural care, though, could have happened without the people who lived on those islands at the time. The stones did not stack themselves, and the passage did not aim itself. So it is those people we should sit with next. We do not know their names, not one of them, and that is worth pausing on for a moment, before we say anything else about them. The men and women who quarried the slabs, who chose the alignment, who stood back at the end of a long summer of labor and looked at what they had made, are entirely anonymous. No inscription records them. No later chronicle preserves them. They left behind their houses, their tools, their pots, their walls, their tomb, and not a single spoken syllable of who they were. It is not the loss you might expect to feel. It is a softer thing than that, a kind of quiet, respectful gap, into which we can only lean and listen. We can, however, sketch the outline of their lives with some confidence, because the archaeology of late Neolithic Orkney is unusually rich. They lived roughly between 3,000 and 2,500 years before the Common Era, so their world overlapped closely with the raising of Maeshowe itself. They were farmers. They kept cattle and sheep, small hardy animals well suited to the island grass. They cultivated barley, and probably other early cereals, on the low, well-drained fields near the locks. They fished the coasts, and gathered shellfish from the tidal rocks. They took whatever the short northern summer offered in the way of wild plants and berries. They were not wanderers. They had settled deeply into these islands, and the islands had settled into them. Their most famous surviving village is Skara Brae, on the western coast of the Orkney mainland, a cluster of stone-built houses that was preserved for us by being buried under sand for thousands of years, until a great storm in the 19th century stripped the dunes back and exposed the tops of the walls. What was uncovered there was almost miraculous. Rooms with stone dressers still standing against the walls, stone beds built into the corners, small stone tanks set into the floors, hearths in the center of each home. It is one of the few places in the world where you can walk through a Neolithic village and see quite clearly where a family kept its cups. Closer to Maeshowe, at a place called Barnhouse, another settlement stood, contemporary with the tomb itself. Barnhouse was smaller than Skara Brae, and it seems to have carried a particular ritual weight. The buildings there are unusual in shape and arrangement, and some have argued that the community living at Barnhouse was directly involved in the ceremonies that surrounded the raising of the great stones nearby, and perhaps the making of the mound itself. The picture is still being drawn, but the pattern of houses, stones, and tomb, all within easy walking distance of one another, suggests a landscape that was thought of as a single place, a single sacred neighborhood, rather than a scatter of unrelated sites. Their building technique was dry stone masonry of exceptional quality, and here Orkney gave them a remarkable gift. The local sandstone splits, naturally, into flat, workable slabs, almost as if the geology itself had done half the mason's work in advance. You can pick up a piece of Orkney flagstone and see that it wants to lie flat, wants to be stacked, wants to be a wall. Given a material that cooperative, and centuries in which to learn its behavior, the Neolithic builders of the islands became astonishingly skilled. Some archaeologists have suggested that Orkney in this period was, culturally, one of the most important places in the whole of Neolithic Britain, and possibly a source of architectural and religious ideas that spread south into what is now England over the following generations. That is a large claim, gently held, but it fits a great deal of what the ground reveals. Their tools were of stone and bone, polished stone axes, ground to a fine edge, for felling wood and shaping timber, flint scrapers and blades for hides and food, bone points and needles for stitching. No metal, not a scrap of it. Everything they built with muscle, patience, and the sharpened remains of the earth itself. Their clothing, as far as we can guess, was of wool and leather, though the details are patchy and the specifics uncertain. Analogous finds from elsewhere in northern Europe give us the general shape of Neolithic dress, tunics and cloaks, and simple footwear. But the exact cut of an Orkney farmer's coat in 2800, before the Common Era, is a thing we can only imagine. Their food we know a little better: barley porridge and a coarse barley bread baked on the hot stones of the hearth, mutton and beef roasted or stewed, shellfish gathered at low tide, fish caught close to shore from small boats that were, in all likelihood, made of skin stretched over a light wooden frame, capable of crossing the short but treacherous straits between the islands. The total population of Orkney at this period was probably not large, a few thousand people perhaps, spread across the whole archipelago, though the number is uncertain and much debated. Enough to build what they built. Not so many that any individual life could be lost in the crowd. Try, if you like, to place yourself among them for a moment, without any strain. It is early evening at Barnhouse. Hearth smoke is curling up through the smoke hole of one of the stone houses, thin and pale against the dusk. A woman walks across the low fields, with a wooden pail, unhurried, her breath visible in the cool air. Somewhere behind a wall, a stone axe is splitting a log for the fire, the sound flat and repetitive and comfortable. Inside, a pot of barley is boiling gently over the flames, and the smell of it, warm and grainy and slightly earthy, fills the small room. A child is doing something quiet in the corner. An old man is mending a net. There is no writing. There are no records. There is only the evening, and the work that goes with it. And then perhaps, on a particular week each winter, that same community gathered at the mound. Torches would have burned in the cold. Breath would have steamed. The people who first raised the stones would have stood together in the failing light, watching the low sun slide toward the ridge, waiting for the moment when the winter light would find the stone. Whatever they said to one another then, whatever prayers or promises or names of the dead were spoken, has gone completely. We have the room. We have the alignment. We do not have the words. They had no word for history. They were history, quietly, without noticing. They did not think of themselves as ancient. They did not think of themselves as a lost civilization. They thought of themselves presumably as the people of this place, in this year, with these fields to work and these dead to remember. The stones they raised were not monuments to their own memory. They were tools, in a way, for the living work of tending the seasons and honoring what had gone before. That the stones would outlast every language they spoke was not a thought that would have occurred to them. It should not, perhaps, occur too heavily to us either. They watched the same sky we watch now, the same low winter sun, the same long summer twilight over the sea, the same stars arranged a little differently by the slow drift of the heavens, but recognizably the same constellations, the same pale spill of the Milky Way over the northern islands. If there is any bridge across the 5,000 years that separate us from them, it is that one. The sky above Orkney has hardly changed. They looked up, and so do we. But the world they made did not last forever. Cultures shift, climates cool and warm, fashions in belief and burial move on. By roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era, the great Neolithic project of Orkney had begun to fade, and the tomb they had built with such care, aligned so precisely to the returning light, entered a much quieter chapter of its existence. It was not destroyed. It was not forgotten in the sense of being lost. It simply passed, slowly, out of daily use, and into that odd category of things that a landscape holds without quite explaining. What happened to Maeshowe in the long, long gap between their time and the coming of the Northmen is one of the quieter parts of this story, and it is where we will turn next. There are roughly 3,000 years between the last Neolithic burial at Maeshowe and the first Viking crawl through its passage. 3,000 years is longer than most civilizations have existed. In our story, it passes in a paragraph. That is a strange kind of injustice, but it is also the honest shape of the evidence. The mound sat on its low plain, and generation after generation walked past it, and almost none of them left a mark that we can read. So we will move through those centuries slowly, but we will not pretend we can fill them. From around 2,500 years before the Common Era onward, the character of life in Orkney began to change. The great stone-building fervor of the late Neolithic softened into something quieter. New metals came into use. New ways of burying the dead took hold, in smaller cists and under smaller cairns, tucked into hillsides rather than raised in vast communal chambers. This is what we call the Bronze Age in these islands, and it did not empty Orkney. It reshaped it. People still farmed the same thin soils, still fished the same sounds, still watched the same low sunset behind the same familiar ridges. They simply did their remembering differently. There are hints, faint and much argued over, that the old mound was not entirely ignored in this long interval. A few finds have been read as possible secondary deposits, small gestures made inside or around the chamber long after its first builders were gone. The evidence is thin and disputed, and honest archaeologists tend to speak of it with a shrug rather than a flourish. It is possible that Bronze Age farmers occasionally slipped inside for reasons of their own. It is equally possible that they left the place alone, treating it as their grandparents had and their grandparents' grandparents before them, as a place that belonged to a time already old. The Iron Age arrived in its slow way, in the last centuries before the Common Era, and Orkney kept farming and fishing and building. Round stone houses gave way, over time, to the tall dry stone towers we call brocks, which still stand in ruined stumps around the coast. Whoever raised those towers looked out from the same windswept fields, at the same low green hill, and so far as we can tell, left it alone. Maeshowe was already, by then, unimaginably old. 2,000 years old at least. Older from an Iron Age farmer's point of view than the pyramids are from ours. Later in the first millennium of the Common Era, the people of Orkney were part of that wider northern world we call Pictish. The Picts were an Iron Age Celtic-speaking people, and they left behind their own particular grammar of memory, carved symbol stones, incised with crescents and mirrors, and beasts that no one can now translate with any confidence. Small farmsteads. Christian influences arriving late, from missionaries drifting north out of Iona and the Irish Sea. Their culture flourished on the islands for centuries. And then, like the cultures before it, it began to give way. Because from the late 8th century of the Common Era onward, a new kind of sail began to appear on the northern horizon. Norse seafarers, out of the fjords of western Norway, came first as raiders, and then as settlers, threading their longships through the archipelagos of the North Atlantic. Orkney, closer to Norway than to almost any other British landfall, was among the earliest and most thoroughly transformed of these places. It did not so much change hands as change tongue. Within a few generations, the older speech of the islands had been almost entirely replaced by Old Norse. The place names we still use today, the Wicks and the Ness endings and the Geos and the Holmes, are the fossilized evidence of that turnover. By the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, Orkney was under firm Norse control. Its farms were run by Norse-speaking families, its politics settled by Norse assemblies, its churches, when they came, built into a Norse Christian world. Eventually, the islands became the seat of the Norse earldom of Orkney, a small but strategically vital polity that answered, in theory, to the kings of Norway, and in practice, often, to whichever earl was strong enough to keep his hall in order. That earldom would matter to our story. In time, but not yet. For the moment, it is enough to picture the arrival itself. A longship rounding a headland at first light, its sail dark against the pale northern sky. The soft repeated dip of oars as it turns into a sheltered bay. Voices carrying across still water in a language the older inhabitants did not know. And then, in the years that followed, the quieter arrivals. Families rather than raiders, livestock coming ashore. Timber being unloaded for the raising of new halls, the slow business of settlement, which does not make it into the songs, but which is how a country actually changes hands. And picture, among those newcomers, a farmer walking the boundary of ground he has just been given, or taken, or bought, depending on which version we choose to believe. He walks the edges of his fields in the low light, and he comes, at some point, to a low green hill on the plain. It is unlike the natural rises around it. Too even, too deliberate. No one in living memory, in his memory or anyone he can ask, has been inside it. It is simply there, part of the landscape he has inherited, and he gives it, most likely, a wide berth. We do not know exactly what the newly arrived Norse made of the ancient monuments they found scattered across their new home. The standing stones on the ridge, the great ring at Brodgar, the low grass mounds like the one on the Stennis Plain. Some scholars have suggested that the Norse folded these older places into their own beliefs about hows, the burial mounds of their own tradition, and about the beings, real or imagined, that were thought to dwell inside them. It is a reasonable inference, and it fits with what we know of Norse attitudes to older graves elsewhere. But it is inference, not documentation. No settler wrote down his first impression of Maeshowe. We have only the shape of the silence, and our own careful guesses at what filled it. What we can say is that the mound endured through all of this without visible change. The Norse tongue slowly displaced the older speech in the fields and the byres. New halls rose. New harbours filled with new ships. New quarrels broke out and were settled by new laws. The wind kept coming off the Atlantic. The winter light kept finding the stone, whether anyone was inside to see it or not. And the mound sat on its plain, silent, closed, faintly ominous to anyone who knew to look at it, a green swelling in a landscape that had grown otherwise familiar. For 3,000 years, nobody wrote a word inside it. And then, one winter, someone did. That is the strange fact around which the rest of this story turns, and the strangeness of it can be left, for a little while, without being solved. We do not need to imagine yet the figure kneeling in the dark. We do not need to reach yet for a chisel or a name. We only need to note that a very long silence broke, and that when it broke in the hand of a Norseman with a knife and a wall to write on. To understand who that someone might have been, and why he found himself, on a winter night, inside a chamber his own great-grandparents would not have dared to enter, we should spend a chapter with the men who were, in that century, running the islands. Not the raiders of the first arrival. Not the settlers who cleared the first fields. Their descendants. The earls, with their halls and their feuds and their careful attention to the sea lanes. The saga world, in which our next figure moves, and in which the tomb at last briefly steps out of its long quiet and back into the human record. We will meet him in the next chapter, an earl of the 12th century, with a long reign and a long shadow, and through him we will begin to close the distance between the men who raised the stones and the men who scratched their names inside them. The Norse in Orkney kept a strange kind of memory. They wrote it down long after the events, on an island a very long way to the west, and they called it a saga. The word itself, in the old tongue, simply means something said, something told, a thing that has been spoken. But over time, it came to mean a particular kind of telling, a long, patient account of families and feuds and voyages, set down in prose, with the shape of history and the flavor of story mingled so closely that no modern reader can quite separate them. The Icelanders, in their turf-roofed farms far out in the northern Atlantic, became the great keepers of this memory, and it is to them, and to one saga in particular, that we owe most of what we know about the Norse centuries in Orkney. The saga is called the Orkney Inga Saga, the saga of the Orkney Islanders. It was composed in Iceland in the early 13th century, drawing on older oral tradition that had been carried across the sea and rehearsed at winter firesides for generations. It tells the deeds of the Earls of Orkney from the 9th century onward, their arrivals, their marriages, their expeditions, their betrayals, their deaths. It is uneven, sometimes cool and factual, sometimes lit by the strange light of legend. But it is, for the whole Norse period in the islands, one of our chief written sources. Without it, the earls would be little more than names on a coin or a charter. With it, they walk and speak and quarrel, however imperfectly, across nearly 4 centuries. Among the most consequential figures in that long list was a man called Harold Maddadsson. He was born around the year 1134, and he died in 1206, and for a very large portion of the 12th century he ruled Orkney, or ruled a share of it, or fought to keep his share of it, with the restless energy of a man who could never quite sit still in his own hall. His mother was of Scottish royal descent, his father a Gaelic-speaking earl from the Scottish mainland, and Harold himself grew up moving between worlds, at home in Norse and Gaelic both, comfortable in the courts of Norwegian kings and Scottish ones. His life, as the saga tells it, was a life of restless motion. He made alliances and broke them. He quarrelled with rival earls over lands and inheritance. He sailed and returned and sailed again. He negotiated with the Norwegian crown that formerly claimed his islands, and with the Scottish crown that increasingly pressed upon them. He raised sons and outlived some of them. He held Orkney for so long that men who had been boys at his accession were grey when he died. The saga, looking back on him from a distance of decades, gives him a mixture of admiration and unease. A strong earl, a difficult earl, a man whose long shadow lay across the islands for the better part of a lifetime. Around him and around the earls who came just before and just after him, the 12th century in Orkney took its particular shape. The old paganism was gone, or gone from public view. The earls were now nominally Christian, and by Harold's own generation, the great cathedral in Kirkwall had begun to rise. St. Magnus Cathedral was founded in the year 1137, in memory of an earlier earl who had been killed in a family quarrel, and then, in the way of such things, remembered as a saint. Its new red and yellow sandstone climbed slowly upward through the 12th century. startlingly pale against the older buildings of the little town, a sign that Orkney had joined, in its own northern way, the wider Christian world. And yet, all around this new world, the older one was still visible in the ground. The islands were full of mounds. Some were small, the graves of individual Norse settlers of earlier centuries. Some were vast and green and ancient, older than any story anyone could tell about them. The earls knew the mound at Stennis was there. They must have. They had grown up in a country that was full of such mounds, and they had names for them. And they had ideas about what lived inside them. And they had stories that were older than Christianity, about how such places should be approached, and how they should be left alone. The 12th century, in this particular corner of the north, is generally the period to which most of the runes carved inside Maeshowe are dated, although the dating carries its own careful uncertainties, and scholars continue to refine it. Some inscriptions have been linked, in the long tradition of Norse scholarship, to specific saga episodes. The saga itself contains at least one passage that a number of scholars have identified, tentatively, as a reference to Maeshowe under a Norse name, sometimes rendered in modern discussions as Orkhaug, though the identification is debated and the reading is not certain. Tradition holds that a group of men, perhaps returning from an expedition, were caught in a heavy winter storm on the Orkney mainland and took refuge inside an old mound. Whether that mound was Maeshowe, and whether the carvings we see now were made in that single episode, or across several visits over several years, is a question to which we have no clean answer. Some have connected the two firmly, others urge caution. The truth in the way of such things is probably softer than either position. What is easier to picture, and safer to picture, is the world these men lived in when they were not underground. A great hall in Kirkwall, in the middle years of the 12th century, low-beamed, warm with the fire in the centre, and the smoke rising to a hole in the roof. Mead in wooden cups, cured meat and dark bread, a man standing to speak, and the room quieting around him, and a saga unfolding in the old rhythmic prose, the earls of 2 centuries walking briefly again through the smoke. Outside, the sea dark and full of movement, the long ships drawn up above the tide line, their timbers ticking as they cooled, the half-built cathedral rising against the stars, its new pale stone waiting for the next season's masons. And out beyond the town, out on the plain between the 2 great locks, unremarked in the daily traffic of ordinary life, a low green hill among other low green hills, a mound roughly 35 meters across, roughly 11 or 12 meters high. Silent, closed, almost 5,000 years old, though nobody in Harold's Hall would have used that number or anything like it. To them it was simply old, older than the sagas, older than the gods the sagas remembered, older than any grandmother's grandmother's tale. They knew it was there, they must have. They passed near it when they rode from one estate to another. They saw it in every light and in every weather, its green flanks going grey in the rain, going gold at long summer evenings, going white and blue in a hard winter. They would have had a word for it. They would have had cautions about it. In the long Norse tradition, mounds were places that repaid respect and punished carelessness. The earls, busy with their feuds and their ships and their new cathedral, would have had little reason to disturb such a place, and rather more reason to let it be. Which is why the fact that someone did, in the end, go inside is the small, strange hinge on which the rest of this story turns. Not an earl, so far as we know. Not a bishop, not a mason from the cathedral works. A group of ordinary Norsemen, likely with an ordinary reason, on a night when the choice was between the shelter of an old grave and the open teeth of an Orkney gale. The saga world, with its earls and its halls and its mead and its long-recited names, is the world these men came out of. Harold Madadson is the shadow across their century, whether or not he ever knew them by name. And somewhere in that century, on a night we cannot date precisely, and in weather we can only imagine from the outside, they turned aside from the road and set to work at the flank of the mound. Which brings us, at last, to the night of the storm. I want to imagine this scene carefully, and I want to be honest with you about which parts we know and which parts we are picturing. The bones of it are these. somewhere in the middle years of the 12th century, most likely between about the year 1150 and the year 1160. Though a wider band of that century is possible, a group of Norsemen came in out of a winter storm and found their way into the old mound. That much the runes themselves suggest, and the saga tradition supports. Beyond that, the details soften. We can picture the night. We cannot quite date it. We can name the century, and sometimes the decade, and no more. An Orkney winter storm is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact with a long memory. The wind comes off the Atlantic across ground that has almost nothing to slow it. No forest, no ridge of high hills, only the low green swells of pasture and the two great lochs lying open to the weather. In such a wind, a person on foot can be knocked from their feet. Sleet moves sideways rather than down. Visibility shrinks to the length of an outstretched arm. The temperature, measured on a thermometer, would not seem extreme, but the wind pulls the warmth out of wet wool as fast as a body can make it. And the cold that follows is the cold that kills quietly, without drama, in the hours before dawn. Into that weather we place our men. Perhaps a dozen of them, perhaps fewer. Perhaps travellers between one estate and another, perhaps a small band on some errand of the Earl's, perhaps only a group of neighbours caught out by a turn in the sky. The runes carry a handful of personal names, and hint, in places, at a company rather than a single visitor. But the inscriptions are fragmentary enough that no full roll call survives. We can imagine them. We cannot know them. What we can say with some confidence is that they were cold, they were wet, and they were looking, as any sensible person in such weather has always looked, for anything at all that would break the wind. And there, on the plain between the lochs, was the mound. They would have known it was there. Every local rider knew it was there. In the whirl of sleet, it may have been little more than a darker shape against a dark sky. A rise of ground where the wind curved and lifted, a shadow one of them recognized, or half remembered, or was led to by a companion who knew this stretch of country better than the rest. It was shelter of a kind. It was ground with a hollow inside it, and on such a night the difference between the open plain and any hollow at all is the difference between morning and no morning. Here the story forks gently into two possibilities, and both are worth setting down side by side. Some scholars have suggested that by the 12th century, the original entrance passage was choked with earth and rubble, blocked by centuries of collapse and drift, and that the Norsemen came in through the roof, or through some compromised upper section of the corbelled stonework, breaking down into the chamber from above. Others have argued that the original low passage was still usable, or could be cleared with a night's hard work, and that forcing a new opening through the tapering roof would have been very difficult indeed. More labour than a group of frozen men would undertake in a gale. Both views have their advocates. Neither can be settled from the stones as they now stand. We may never know exactly where they lifted the first turf, or shifted the first stone. What we can say more firmly is that they got in. By the time they left their marks upon the walls, they were standing inside the central chamber, able to move about, able to reach up with a tool, able to gather in a rough circle out of the wind. The interior was dry. The interior was, above all, still. That stillness alone, after hours in the storm, would have been a kind of miracle. The wind that had been in their ears for so long would have dropped away almost entirely, replaced by the small, close sounds of their own breathing, the drip of sleet melting from wool, the scrape of a boot on old stone. Picture the first man through. Whether he came down from above into a fall of loose earth, or crawled the length of that low tunnel on his hands and knees, the last stretch would have been dark and tight, and full of the smell of old ground. There would have been a pause before anyone went further in. It is a very human pause, the pause at the threshold of a place you did not build and do not understand. In the Norse world, mounds were not neutral ground. They were places where the dead were said sometimes to stir, places where certain things were said to live. A man with cold hands and a wet beard, easing forward into a dark he could not measure, would have felt the weight of every warning his grandmother had ever given him. And then the passage would have opened out. That is the striking thing about the interior of that mound. The tunnel is low and long and mean, and then, without warning, The roof lifts, and the walls step back, and the chamber is simply there, large enough to stand in, large enough to gather in, its corbelled roof rising into a darkness that no eye adjusted to sleet could yet read. Someone would have struck a light, perhaps a small tallow candle carried inside a coat, perhaps a little oil lamp of the kind used in houses and byres across the islands, its flame steadied slowly by hands that were still shaking. And in that first thin light, the chamber would have revealed itself in pieces. A slab of wall, immensely large, immensely well fitted. A corner, sharper than any corner in any house they knew. A high place above where the light would not quite reach. Stones set with a care that no living mason of their acquaintance had ever equalled, and no living mason of their acquaintance could quite explain. They would not have known the age of what they were looking at. They had no way of knowing. There was no chronology in their heads that could hold a number like 3,000 years. No calendar that ran back through the empty centuries to the people who had first raised those stones. To them it was simply old, older than anything, older than any story. They had come in out of the wind. They had come, without knowing it, into a room 3,000 years older than their gods. For a while one imagines very little happened. Men who have been near the edge of freezing do not become clever companions in a hurry. They would have sat, or crouched, and unwrapped what damp food they had, and passed the light between them, and let their hands come back to themselves, finger by finger. Someone would have looked up into the tapering dark of the roof, and looked away again. Someone would have run a palm along the join of two great stones, and shaken his head quietly at what he felt. Someone would have made a joke, because men do, and the joke would have sounded small in that space, and been welcome for it. Outside, the storm went on. Inside, the hours of that long night passed in the way such hours do, in silences and murmurs, and the small business of staying alive. Perhaps they slept a little, in turns. Perhaps they did not sleep at all. The mound held them, patient as it had been patient through nearly 5,000 winters. Indifferent as old ground is always indifferent to whoever crouches on it for a night. And then, at some point during that long night, one of them reached out and touched the wall. It is a small gesture, a hand against stone, the kind of thing a person does without thinking, when there is nothing else to do and the wall is there. But this hand had a knife in it, or an axe head, or the point of some other iron tool, and this wall had a surface that would take a mark, and this man was a man of a culture that had been carving its alphabet into wood and bone and stone for generations. What he did with that reach is a chapter of its own. There are, on the walls of Maeshowe, more than 30 separate runic inscriptions. It is the largest single collection of runes anywhere in Britain, and one of the largest anywhere in the world. They were not carved all at once, and they were not carved by one hand. They accumulated the way graffiti accumulates in any place where people shelter and wait, added to across weeks or months, or perhaps across more than one visit, until the stones of the central chamber had become a kind of quiet ledger of who had passed through the dark. The alphabet they used was the younger Futhark, the runic script of the Norse world in the Viking and medieval centuries. It is a spare and angular alphabet made almost entirely of straight lines, because straight lines are what a knife or an axe point will cut cleanly into stone. Curves are for ink and parchment, and the patient labor of a scriptorium. A cold man in a dry chamber with an iron blade in his fist works in straight lines, and the younger Futhark obliges him. Its letters are thin, tilted, economical. They look, on the wall, almost like scratches a wind might have made, until you look again and see the pattern in them. They are lightly incised into the slab stone, shallow grooves cut with the tip of a sharp tool. Some are crisp still, their edges as clean as the day they were made. Some are softened, blurred by 9 centuries of the mound's slow breathing, by damp and by the faint mineral weeping of the stones. Some cluster densely, one inscription running into the next, hand pressing beside hand. Others stand alone, a single small statement on an empty face of rock, as if the man who made it wanted his line to have room around it. They are, most of them, at eye level in the central chamber. That detail is worth pausing on. They sit exactly where a standing man of average height would find it comfortable to reach, and comfortable to see if he were holding a small lamp in his other hand. You can, if you like, picture the choreography of it. The lamp lifted in the left hand, the flame steady in the still air of the chamber. The right hand raised to the wall, the blade turned so its point could bear on the stone. The head tilted slightly, the eyes closed, so that the man carving could see the line as it emerged. It is the posture of any human being at any time who has ever bent close to a surface to leave a mark on it. On stylistic and linguistic grounds, most scholars date the runes to the middle of the 12th century, though a range, reaching a little into the 13th century, is thought possible, that places them squarely in the world of the Norse earldom, in the generations around the Earl already spoken of, in the era when Orkney was as much a Scandinavian country as it was a British one. Some of the inscriptions may have been made on a single occasion, perhaps by the party sheltering from that winter storm. Others may have been added later, by pilgrims of a different sort, by curious visitors, by travellers who had heard that there was a broken mound in Stennis parish, where one could go inside and put one's name upon the stones. Because Maeshowe is dry, and because it has held its temperature and its stillness across the centuries, with the patience of a good cellar, the runes have survived in a condition that is frankly astonishing. Conservators today monitor them carefully, watching for the small changes that damp and human breath can bring. But a visitor who leans close can still see the marks essentially as they were made, groove for groove, letter for letter. There are not many things in Britain or in Europe of which that can be said. 900 years is a long time for a scratch in stone to remain a scratch in stone, and not become simply a shadow on a surface. Because of this preservation, modern archaeologists have come to treat the inscriptions as historical artifacts in their own right, quite apart from the tomb they are carved upon. In some ways, the runes are more directly informative than Maeshowe itself. The chamber tells us about a people we cannot name. The runes tell us the names, or at least some of the names, and something of the humours and small vanities of the men who left them. They are one of the closest things we have to the ordinary voice of a 12th century Norseman, unmediated by saga, unshaped by a scribe writing for a patron. Just a man, and a knife, and a wall. They are not, however, entirely legible. Some of the runes are damaged. Some are incomplete, broken off at the edge of a slab, or worn thin by moisture in a particular corner. Some sequences have been read in 2 or 3 different ways by scholars of equal seriousness, and translations differ, sometimes on quite important words. There are inscriptions about which specialists still debate whether a given rune is one letter or another, whether a given phrase means what it seems to mean, or something quieter and stranger. So even the wall itself, even these most direct voices we have from that long night and the visits that followed it, is not entirely a settled document. It is a text under discussion, still, but the essential act of it is not in dispute. In the darkness of that chamber, by whatever small light they carried, they reached out and cut their marks into the stone. You can, if you close your eyes for a moment, almost hear the sound of it, though of course we cannot really know what it sounded like. The small dry whisper of iron on rock. A pause. The whisper again. Cold breath in a cold place. The knife tip finding purchase. The wrist steady, the line lengthening by a fraction of an inch at a time. It is not a fast business, carving runes. It is patient work, done by patient hands. And the fact that they took the time to do it, in the middle of a storm, in a place that must have felt strange and heavy around them, tells us something about them before we have read a single word. When each mark was finished, it would have shown pale against the darker weathered face of the slab. A slim, bright groove where the fresh mineral inside the stone had been laid open. In the flicker of a small flame, the letters would have seemed to move very slightly, catching and losing the light. The carver could stand back a pace and see his work, and know it was there, and know it would remain there after he had gone out through the low tunnel again, and back into whatever weather waited for him. 9 centuries later, a visitor to Maeshowe stands in the same chamber, in the cool, dry air, and leans in close, breath fogging faintly, and reads the same marks. Not always with certainty, not always with a full translation to hand, but reading them all the same, letter by angular letter, the way one might read a message left on a table in a house one has borrowed. The distance between that man with his blade and this visitor with her attentive eye is 900 winters. And yet the marks are unchanged, and the eye finds them exactly where the hand left them. They wanted to be remembered. They succeeded. That is, in the end, the plain fact of it. Whoever they were, whatever their errand in Orkney had been, whatever storm or curiosity or boredom had driven them down that low passage, they came into the chamber and they put their names, or their boasts, or their small private jokes, onto the wall. And those names and boasts and jokes are still there. Empires have risen and fallen in the time since. Languages have shifted. Whole ways of living have been forgotten, and the scratches those men made in the dark have outlasted almost all of it, patient as the mound around them. What they wanted us to remember them for is in itself a small human comedy. You might expect, given the setting, that the runes carved into a nearly 5,000-year-old tomb would be solemn things. Prayers, perhaps. Elegies. Farewells whispered into stone by men who understood that they stood inside a place older than any memory their people carried. Some of the inscriptions are indeed serious, or at least appear to reach after something more than the moment. But a great many are not. A great many are, in truth, exactly the sort of thing a person scratches on any old wall in any old place when they have a blade in their hand and time on their hands and companions watching. The dignity of the mound did not silence them. If anything, it seems to have loosened their tongues. The largest category, by a comfortable margin, is the simplest. A name and the statement that this name carved these runes. So-and-so was here and cut these letters and wishes it to be known. The formula appears again and again along the walls, in slightly different phrasings and slightly different hands. And it is essentially the pattern of personal graffiti found in Norse contexts across the medieval world, from harbours in Ireland to churches in Constantinople. A man arrives somewhere unusual, and he writes his name. That is the whole of it. He does not explain his errand. He does not date his visit. He simply fixes his existence to the place, as if pinning a note to a door. Alongside these bare signatures run the boasts. Some of the carvers were not content merely to have been present. They wanted the wall to know that they were skilled at the very craft they were practicing on it. There are lines, whose exact wording scholars continue to debate, that appear to claim the carver as the finest rune cutter in Orkney, or in the western lands, or among all those who had sailed the seas. It is possible some of these were said in earnest, and some in jest. It is possible the men laughed as they scratched them. We cannot easily separate the swaggering young man from the older master. At this distance, and perhaps the wall itself never distinguished between them. A blade cuts the same either way. Then there are the references to treasure. Several inscriptions on the walls of the chamber turn, plainly and unmistakably, toward the subject of riches. One line speaks of treasure carried away from the mound. Another mentions treasure hidden nearby, or great wealth once concealed in the surrounding ground. Another suggests that the mound had already been robbed before the carver's own arrival. Whether any physical hoard was actually taken from inside Maeshowe, or whether these lines are half a boast and half a legend told to impress a listener who was not there, no one can now say with any confidence. The stone gives us the words. It does not give us the goods. Some have imagined, over the centuries since the inscriptions were first read, that a real trove was lifted out of the chamber that winter and lost forever to some private hoard, or spent in some Norwegian market, or buried again in a place no one remembered by the following spring. Fringe accounts have wandered further still, picturing Pictish gold, or even older wealth taken from the Neolithic dead. The more cautious mainstream view is quieter. It notes that the runes may well be more boast than record, that a man who has just squeezed into an ancient mound in a storm has every reason to leave with a story larger than the truth, and that we simply do not know what, if anything, they carried out through the low tunnel with them. The absence of a hoard proves nothing. The presence of the words proves only that treasure was on their minds. A great many of the inscriptions concern women. This, more than anything else, is what tends to surprise a modern visitor, who has come expecting solemnity. Names of particular women appear on the walls, sometimes praised, sometimes teased about, sometimes fastened to the names of the men who carved them, in the immemorial fashion of one name written beside another, with the small implication of everything in between. There are lines that seem affectionate, celebrating a woman for her beauty or her worth. There are lines that seem bawdy, delivered with the raised eyebrow of a man performing for his companions. There are lines that seem more private, closer to the sort of message a person writes when they do not quite believe anyone will ever read it. Taken together, they are strikingly, disarmingly human. They belong less to a saga than to a tavern. And then there are the playful lines, the jokes, the little games, the remarks that have no obvious purpose beyond amusing the man beside the carver, or embarrassing the man on the other side of him, or filling a gap in the evening. These are the lines that scholars sometimes translate with a small smile at the end of the sentence, because they are the sort of thing that has always been scratched into old stone by young men with too much time on their hands and a sharp tool in their pockets. The chamber of Maeshowe on that winter night or nights was not only a shelter and a wonder. It was also, briefly, a place where friends teased one another and preserved the teasing in stone. It is not difficult, standing in the low quiet of the chamber now, to imagine the scene. One man kneeling at the wall, tongue perhaps caught between his teeth, cutting the name of a woman he had left behind somewhere across the water. Another man beside him, laughing at the choice of letters, or the shape of them, or the sentiment itself. A third rolling over on his cloak and pulling it up around his ears, and going back to sleep, uninterested in the whole enterprise, wanting only for the storm outside to end. The lamps burn low against the stone. The flames are small and yellow and lean when a draught finds them. The shadows of the men move on the walls in the slow way that shadows move when the light is close and the room is still. Perhaps, though this is only a soft supposition, a dog had been brought down with them out of the weather, and lay curled on a wet heap of wool at someone's feet, breathing the deep, even breath of an animal glad to be out of the wind. Perhaps not. The stone records the words of men and not the presence of their companions. But the choreography of it is not hard to picture. One holds the light, another cuts the letter. A third watches, or comments, or dozes. The blade finds purchase. The line lengthens. The pale groove appears in the darker face of the slab. The next letter is begun. They wrote, in the end, what people always write on old walls. That they had been there. That they had loved someone, or wanted to be thought to have loved someone. That they had, or thought they had, been very clever. That there had been treasure, or that they wished there had been. That a particular friend was ridiculous, and that a particular rival was worse. It is a small human comedy carved into a monument built by strangers 3,000 years before them, and it is one of the reasons Maeshowe holds the imagination the way it does. The gravity of the place did not overwhelm the men who came into it. They brought their ordinary lives in with them, and left a little of it behind on the walls. After that winter, or those winters, whatever the true number of visits was, the door of the mound was closed again. The low passage lay empty. The chamber, with its new inscriptions running along the older stones, settled once more into its cool and patient dark. The wind went on across the fields of Stennis. The sea went on against the cliffs. The seasons wheeled through their long, slow turns. And no one for a very long time came again to disturb the letters the Northmen had left. The mound waited, once more, in the silence it had always kept best. And it would go on waiting, through winter after winter, and century after century, until a different kind of visitor arrived at last, in a different kind of age, with lanterns of their own, and notebooks in their pockets, and a wholly new set of questions to bring down into the dark. There is a particular sort of 19th century gentleman who I find, from a great distance, oddly moving. He has read too much. He has walked too far. He has a candle in his hand and a notebook in his coat pocket, and he believes, sincerely, that the world can be understood if only he looks at enough of it. He is not a professional in any sense we would recognize now. He is a doctor, perhaps, or a minister, or a landowner with time on his hands and an interest in old stones. He has corresponded with other men like himself, in Edinburgh and in London, on the subject of tumuli cysts and the meaning of certain marks upon rock. And in the middle years of the 19th century, he, or men very like him, turned their attention at last to the great green mound that had stood, closed and quiet, in the fields of Stennis for as long as anyone in Orkney could remember. The formal re-entry of Maeshowe belongs, in the standard accounts, to the 1860s, and the year most often given is 1861. The work was carried out by local Orcadian antiquaries in the tradition of early Scottish archaeology, and it belonged to that peculiarly Victorian moment when the study of the ancient past was still half a gentleman's hobby and half a young science, feeling its way toward the disciplines it would one day become. They came with picks and with lanterns. They came with sketchbooks and measured drawings. They came with the settled conviction that the mound had something to tell them, and that patience and pencil and light were the tools by which it might be persuaded to speak. What they found, of course, was not empty ground. The tomb had already been entered long before by the Northmen whose winter shelter had left its long chain of letters along the walls. The runes were still there, waiting, and the antiquaries recognized at once that they were looking at something extraordinary. They mapped the interior of the chamber. They measured the passage. They noted the corbelling of the roof and the placement of the side cells. And they set themselves, with the peculiar devotion of their kind, to the slow copying of every rune they could find, character by character, in careful hands, so that the marks made by 12th century men in the dark could be studied at leisure in the parlours and libraries of a very different age. It was not, by modern standards, a flawless piece of work. 19th century excavation was a rougher art than ours. A little damage was done here, a little overcleaning there, some rearrangement of stones whose original positions can now only be guessed at. Modern conservators, working within Maeshowe today, have to accommodate the enthusiasms of their predecessors, gently, in the way one accommodates a well-meaning ancestor whose methods no longer suit the house. But the copies of the runes they made were, on the whole, remarkably faithful, and to this day scholars comparing the Victorian drawings to the surviving inscriptions find that the antiquaries saw and recorded very nearly what is there. Very nearly. Not exactly. Working by candlelight in a cold stone chamber, with a pencil in a gloved hand and breath fogging in the air, even a careful eye can read a character in one way where a modern epigrapher, with better light and a century of further scholarship, reads it another. A stroke that seems a clear vertical to one observer may, to another, be the ghost of an older scratch beneath a newer letter. And so our knowledge of what is written on the walls of Maeshowe is itself layered. Neolithic hands cut the stones. Norse hands cut the runes. Victorian hands copied the runes. Modern hands have reread the copies and reread the walls and refined the readings again. Our understanding of this place is itself a kind of stratigraphy, one careful reading laid down upon another, over years and years. I think of that Victorian gentleman quite often when I think of Maeshowe. I picture him in his heavy coat, buttoned against the Orkney wind, kneeling to enter the low passage, the candle lantern in one hand, throwing a small yellow wobble along the slabs. I picture the moment he emerges into the chamber and straightens slowly, and the shadow of his top hat rises against the corbelled stone, absurd and dignified all at once. I picture him lifting the lantern, and the light finding first one rune and then another, and the small involuntary sound he must have made, half breath and half word, when he understood what he was looking at. And then I picture the sound that followed, the scratch of a pencil on paper, rune after rune, letter after letter, copied down by a man who felt, quite sincerely, that he was the first educated eye to see these words in centuries. He was not wrong about that, or not very wrong. He was late to this room by 5,000 years. He was early to it by all the visitors who would come after. The stone caught his lamplight, as it had once caught the tallow candle light of the Northmen, as it had once, in a still deeper past, caught the light of the midwinter sun down the length of the passage into the heart of the chamber. Each of these lights was different, and each was, in its own way, an act of attention. A community aligning a tomb to the turning of the year, a band of Norsemen sheltering from a storm and writing their names for want of anything better to do. A gentleman with a notebook copying those names by candle so that other gentlemen, elsewhere, might read them. Maeshowe has been, among other things, a place that people bring lights into. It has patiently returned each light with the same cold silver of its slabs. After the Victorians came the slow apparatus of the modern state. The mound was recognized as a monument of national importance, and in due course placed under formal protection. In 1999 it was inscribed by UNESCO, along with the nearby villages and stone circles, as part of the heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. It is managed today by Historic Environment Scotland, and visitors come to it in small guided groups, in ordinary weather, wearing ordinary coats. They stoop through the same low passage the Northmen crawled along in the winter of the 12th century, and along which, 5,000 years ago or so, the people who first raised the stones must have carried their own dead, or their offerings, or their fires. There is something quietly moving about that continuity of small human bodies moving through a small dark space. The passage does not care who is passing. The corbelled roof does not distinguish between a Neolithic mourner and a Norse raider, and a Victorian antiquary and a visitor in a waterproof jacket in the 21st century. It leans inward above all of them, in the same tapering geometry, and receives them all into the same chamber, and lets them all, in their turn, straighten up and look around. The runes are still on the walls. The copies made by the antiquaries are still in the archives. The modern readings are still being refined, quietly, in journals and monographs that only a few people in the world will ever read closely. The mound itself sits, as it has always sat, in its field beside the loch, weather passing over it, sheep grazing around it, the low grey light of Orkney moving slowly across its grassy back. It has absorbed all of this. It seems, if anything, to have grown more patient with time, not less. And so we come, by this long path, back to the question that has been quietly waiting for us since the beginning. What did any of these people feel when they were inside? The Neolithic builders, the Norsemen with their blades and their boasts, the gentleman with his candle, the visitor today. What is it to stand inside a chamber older than the language you think in, older than the gods your ancestors prayed to, older than the idea of the country you were born in? Which brings us, gently, to the deepest question our story has been circling all along. The title of this evening's story promises us a tomb that terrified the Vikings who broke into it. And I have to be honest with you now, at the calm end of the night, about what we actually know, which is, in the end, rather less than the promise suggests. There is no line among the runes on the wall that reads, "We are afraid." There is no line that reads, "This place is haunted," or "We should not have come in." The carvings, on their surface, are boasts and jokes and lovers' names, the ordinary graffiti of men sheltering out of a storm. If we are looking for a confession of dread scratched into the stone, we will not find one. The mound does not hand us its answer that easily. And yet the wider world these men came from was a world that took such places very seriously indeed. From the sagas and the law codes and the fragments of folklore that survive, we know that the Norse looked upon old burial mounds, the howes scattered across their landscapes, as places charged with something more than earth and stone. A howe was not simply a hill, it was a threshold. It belonged in some sense to whatever lay inside it, and whatever lay inside it was not entirely gone. Norse tradition includes the figure of the haugboy, the mound dweller, a kind of restless presence understood to inhabit old barrows and to resent intrusion. It includes the landvatir, the land spirits, powers thought to dwell in particular hills and stones and stretches of coast, powers to be respected and sometimes gently placated by those who lived alongside them. These beliefs are not doctrine exactly. They are the quieter grammar of how a person walked through the world. You did not likely break the roof of an old mound. You did not likely speak inside. One you knew, or your grandmother knew, that certain places had a memory of their own. The sagas keep this awareness alive in their stories. Men enter old barrows in search of buried treasure, in more than one Icelandic tale, and what they meet inside is rarely just gold. They meet resistance. They meet a figure seated in the dark. They meet a wrestling match they had not bargained for. These are literary scenes, and we should be careful with them. They are not court records. They are not eyewitness testimony. But they tell us something honest about the cultural imagination of the 12th and 13th centuries. The imagination in which the Earl's men in Orkney were also raised. The saga written down in Iceland in that early 13th century belongs to the same mental world. And then there is the further layer, the layer that makes the question harder rather than easier. By the 12th century, the Norse world of Orkney was a Christian world. Churches stood on the islands. Priests said Mass. The Earl himself moved within a Christian political order. But Christianity, when it arrived in the north, did not simply erase what had come before. It settled on top of older feeling, and the older feeling did not entirely go away. It is at least possible, and many historians have gently suggested this, that a baptized man in the 12th century could kneel in a Christian church on Sunday and still feel, on a storm-lashed winter night, inside an ancient mound, that certain things ought not to be disturbed. The two beliefs did not so much cancel each other as sit side by side in the same chest. So when we try to picture those men in the chamber, on that particular winter night, we are picturing human beings who walk through the world with, perhaps, a heightened awareness of unseen presences. Men who understood that this hill was not simply a hill. Men who, having crawled in for shelter, may well have felt in the first quiet moment after the wind was shut behind them, the weight of what surrounded them. The corbelled roof leaning inward, the side cells opening off the walls like small dark mouths, the silence beneath the storm, older than any silence they had known before. Perhaps one of them whispered a prayer, perhaps to Thor, perhaps to Christ, perhaps without noticing the contradiction, to both. Perhaps another laughed too loudly, the way men do when they are not quite easy. Perhaps the carving itself, the drawing of a blade across stone to leave a name, was in some small way a defense. A boast can be a form of courage. A boast can also be a form of whistling in the dark. It is at least possible that when a man scratched, in confident runes, that he had lifted a great treasure out of this place, part of what he was doing was insisting to himself and to his companions that he was the master of the room. That the room did not master him. All of that is speculation, and it is offered as such. We cannot know what those men felt. We have their names, or some of them. We have their little jokes. We have the boast about the treasure, and the lines about winning, and the small, tender assertions of having been present. What we do not have is a single sentence in which any of them tells us what it was like to sit inside a chamber 3,000 years older than their own gods. That sentence was never written. It is not among the runes. It is not in the saga. It is not in any manuscript we have yet found. And so the macro question, which has been quietly waiting for us since the very first minutes of this evening, receives its honest answer. What did those men feel that night, in the dark of a 5,000-year-old room? We do not know. We may never know. And there is something quietly beautiful about that. Something almost restful if you let it be. Let us picture the scene one more time, gently, and then let it go. The chamber, dimly lit, perhaps by a single small lamp, perhaps by a torch guttering in the damp air. Wet cloaks steaming faintly in the little warmth of that flame. Faces half in shadow, half in a wavering orange light. One man kneeling near the wall, working at the stone with the tip of an iron blade. The tiny sound of metal on rock small and dry and precise, beneath the larger sound of weather. Others watching, or not watching, drifting in their own thoughts, listening to the wind above. Outside the storm continues, unappeasable, indifferent to their names and their carvings and their prayers. And in the walls around them, folded quietly into the geometry of the corbelling, are nearly 5,000 years of silence, and the small side cells in which the ancestors of a people they had never heard of once lay in the dark. They did not stay forever. The storm passed, or their errand called them onward, or the light of morning found them, and they gathered their things and went. They left the mound the way they had come, stooping through the low passage, back out into the ordinary weather of Orkney. They left their names. They left the boast about the treasure, and the lines about the women who had been beautiful, and the small proud statements of skill in the cutting of runes. They left, without meaning to, a question that we are still sitting with tonight, nearly 900 years later, in the quiet of our own rooms. Whether they felt fear, whether they felt awe, whether they felt only the ordinary tiredness of cold men glad to be out of the wind, is not for us to say with certainty. The mound has kept its counsel. The Neolithic builders kept theirs. The winter light still finds the stone once a year, in the way it was arranged to do, and it does not explain itself either. Some places, it seems, are content to be older than our questions. They let us come in and stand for a while and go out again, and they do not tell us what we are standing inside. So let us sit with it a little longer. The image of the chamber, the small iron sound of a blade on rock, the storm above, the 5,000 years of quiet beneath, and then let us let it go, gently the way one lets go of a thought at the edge of sleep, without needing to finish it, without needing to solve it, without needing anything from it at all. The mound is still there. It is there tonight, at this exact moment, as I speak and as you listen. The Orkney wind is moving over its grass. If it is winter where the tomb stands, the days are short, and the light on the mound is grey. And somewhere in the low southwestern sky, on the right day, the sun is finding its old alignment. If it is summer there, the evenings are long and pale, and the stones sit under a sky that never fully darkens. All the men we have talked about tonight are gone. The Neolithic builders are gone, and their names went with them, and they will not come back. The Earl is gone. The unnamed rune carver is gone. The Victorians with their lanterns are gone. Everyone who has ever walked into that low tunnel and out again is gone, except for the ones who happen to still be alive tonight. And even they are only there for a little while. The stones are still standing. The mound is still holding its shape. The runes are still on the wall. You do not need to hold on to any of the names tonight. If Harold has slipped away, that is all right. If you do not remember exactly when the mound was built, that is all right. If the whole middle of this story has drifted past you like weather, that is exactly as it should be. This was never a lecture. It was a place we sat in together, in the dark, for a little while. You can let it go now. You can let the tomb close behind you. You can let the storm outside it settle. You can let the Northmen return to their ships, and the people who first raised the stones return to their hearths, and the whole long chain of visitors return gently to wherever it is they came from. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes. Sleep is not failure here. Sleep is the point. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only the room you are in, and the voice, and the soft weight of tiredness that has been settling on you all evening, and the permission, which was always yours, to sleep. 5,000 years ago, on a small green island at the top of Britain, someone built a room for the dead, and pointed it at the midwinter sun. 900 years ago, a group of frightened, or brave, or simply cold men crawled inside it and scratched their names on the wall. Tonight, a very long time later, you and I have sat with it for a while. The stones are still there. The runes are still there. The sun still finds the passage every year at the darkest turn of the year. And you can rest. Good night, from wherever this finds you.